the right these in there. Subcommittee will come to order. Good morning to everyone. Today we conduct the second in a series of hearings focusing on the National Broadband Plan, and I want to commend the, did I just go off the air? This is the Technology Subcommittee. We can do better than this. I'm sorry? Okay, all right, so it was turned down. I'm making too much noise. That was the point. Yeah, all right. We're conducting this morning the second in a series of hearings focusing on the National Broadband Plan. And I want to commend the members of the Federal Communications Commission and their staffs for the truly outstanding job that they have done in compiling this plan, sorting through thousands of comments that have been received from the public, and providing very thoughtful work and good recommendations to the Congress. The United States stands 16th today among developed nations in broadband usage, and for the benefit of our national economy and for our national quality of life, we need to do better. In preparing the National Broadband Plan, the Commission has made a major contribution to our effort to evaluate our national standing to a far higher number, and we are appreciative to the Commission for that work. Broadband in the 21st century is as important as telephone service or electricity service were when they were first introduced more than a century ago. Today's hearing focuses on how best to deploy broadband to areas that are unserved and underserved so that all Americans, including those in the rural reaches of our nation, may benefit from this truly essential infrastructure. We want to ensure that everyone has access to broadband, and we also want to ensure that everyone has access at meaningful speeds and at truly affordable prices. The National Broadband Plan reports that 95% of American homes have access to terrestrial fixed broadband infrastructure capable of supporting actual download speeds of at least 4 megabits per second, leaving approximately 7 million homes unserved. I have serious concerns about the accuracy of that number and the methodology that was employed in order to derive it. It's my understanding that for cable modem service, the broadband team looked at maps of where every cable operator is authorized to provide service. The broadband team assumed that a cable operator should have built out to its entire service territory. It also assumed that each provider was using at least DOCSIS 2.0 technology, which would mean that every home within the service area could get broadband speeds of at least 4 megabits per second downstream and 1 megabit per second upstream. Unfortunately, not every cable operator has deployed service throughout its franchise area, and not every cable operator has upgraded to DOCSIS 2.0 technology. For DSL service offered by phone companies, the broadband team relied on broadband maps from states that have already completed those maps. The team calculated where homes should be able to receive DSL service of at least 4 megabits per second downstream, 1 megabit upstream. Based on where those maps indicated, there is a broadband infrastructure in place. The team also estimated that homes within a certain number of feet of central offices should be able to receive broadband. The team then extrapolated those figures to the entire nation. Unfortunately, I think the experience is very different. In my own example with my constituency in Virginia, the broadband map that was provided in my home state of Virginia has proven to be less than satisfactory as a genuine predictor of where broadband can be found. The map is based on data provided by the telephone companies, and it over-reports the availability of broadband in my district, and I'm sure elsewhere. I frequently hear complaints from constituents who live in communities that the Virginia broadband map indicates are served, yet these constituents are persistently asking for broadband service because today they have none. To the extent that the team extrapolated data from the Virginia broadband map and others like it, I can't, based on my experience, consider those projections to be reliable. I appreciate that Ms. Gillette will testify in her testimony today that the 95% figure is intended to be an estimate of homes that should have access to broadband based on what is estimated about where incumbent providers have deployed the infrastructure. It does not mean that someone in an area the broadband plan predicts would have broadband service could actually pick up a phone, call their service provider, and receive broadband service. That's an important clarification, and one that I hope all members will keep in mind as we develop policies that are based on the assumptions of broadband availability. As we will hear from other witnesses on today's panel, there remain many areas of our nation without access to broadband, or with access to broadband only at slow speeds and at high prices. It's far too soon to declare mission accomplished with respect to the goal of making broadband available to all Americans. I want to thank our witnesses for joining us this morning. We look forward to your testimony. And at this time, I'm pleased to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to welcome Bob Latta from Ohio. He's on our committee, and we'll recognize him and welcome him to this great subcommittee. His predecessor, Paul Gilmore, and I came in together, and he served on this committee too, so we're delighted to have you. I think all of us in this room and all of the folks on the committee would agree that there's tremendous benefits from broadband. Reaching 100% omnipresent broadband is a laudable goal. Most of us wonder what's the best way to do it, and I think a lot of us think that it can be done through private investment, much like we see either the iPhone or the iPad or the iTunes or the multiple of devices just pick up and everybody has them, whether you're in rural or urban areas, because the incentives are there. For the United States to achieve this ubiquitous broadband deployment, I believe the private sector will have to shoulder the bulk of the financial burden, and our policies on this committee should reflect that. As you mentioned, according to the broadband plan, approximately 290 million Americans, or 95%, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, the population have access to at least 4 megabits per second broadband service, while approximately two-thirds of all Americans, about 200 million people, subscribe to broadband. This is up from 8 million 10 years ago, so you can see that it's moving forward. All these numbers demonstrate our free market, pro-investment approach to broadband, that it's working. Even if the government took no action, the broadband plan concludes that private sector investment will provide 90% of the country with access to peak download speeds of more than 50 megabits per second by the year 2013. Now, if the past decade of broadband investment is any guide, the private sector will likely take us the rest of the way to the broadband plan goal of reaching 100 million households with 100 megabytes per second service by 2020. Simply letting the private investment pursue its way. Although reaching that goal will cost approximately $350 million, the cable, telephone, and wireless industries have been investing $60 billion a year in broadband, suggesting we could hit the investment target within 6 years. That's $350 billion. The recent D.C. Circuit ruling that struck down the FCC attempt to regulate Comcast's network management of Internet congestion should further caution against straying from our deregulatory approach. Even after the decision, the FCC still has plenty of explicit authority to implement the broadband plan that they put out. In rejecting the FCC's argument, the D.C. Circuit explained, quote, statements of congressional policy can help delineate the contours of statutory authority, end quote. Congress issued such a policy statement in 1996 when it added Section 230 to the Communications Act. My colleagues, that section makes it the policy of the United States to, quote, to preserve the vibrant and competitive free market that presently exists for the Internet and other interactive computer services unfettered by federal or state regulation, end quote. So whether to revisit that legislated policy, which the broadband plan data confirms has worked so well, is a matter for Congress and not the FCC's position. This does not mean, of course, that the government has no role If we are going to subsidize broadband deployment, it makes sense to concentrate on the 5% of the population, about 7 million homes, that do not have access to broadband, not the 95% that already do. We could target the unserved homes with an FCC universal service program that has been significantly reformed, perhaps along the lines outlined in the broadband plan. We can also use wireless and satellite services that might better reach those hard-to-serve places, including tribal lands. Government intervention is only appropriate, however, to target those homes that are otherwise uneconomic for the private sector to reach out and serve. To do otherwise would force the private sector to compete against the government or government-funded entities. Such skewing of market forces will only harm investment and innovation in the long run. What Congress and the FCC must do is not revert to failed regulatory ideas that were designed for old technologies in a monopoly-era marketplace. Imposing network neutrality, for example, forcing access to facilities and regulating rates are the surest way to deter the investment we need to reach the broadband plan's goal. The benefit of quality of broadband, I think, is obvious to all of us. It's important that all Americans, whether in a big city, rural community, or tribal land, have access to this technology. That I agree. The question remains, how do we get there? I don't think we should let this opportunity pass us by. Mr. Chairman, I think there's a great opportunity with these witnesses, and I look forward to hearing their opening statements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stearns. The chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing on deploying broadband service to unserved and underserved communities across the nation. Because broadband is critical to future economic growth and job creation, every American must have the opportunity to access high-quality, high-speed broadband from a variety of providers. The plan provides a blueprint on how the public sector policies can promote deployment to both unserved and underserved communities. It also speaks to ways in which the private sector can act. By utilizing all the tools the public and private sectors have at their collective disposal, we can achieve a primary goal of the National Broadband Plan, 99% access to high-speed broadband within 10 years. While there are a number of proposals in the plan, I would commend the FCC staff for their thoroughness, and I'd like to take a moment to highlight a couple that I find to be promising. For example, the plan recognizes that substantial cost savings can occur from better planning and coordination among government resources and recommends that all federally funded rights-of-way projects include a broadband conduit at the time of construction. This proposal is similar to legislation introduced by Congresswoman Eshoo, of which I am a co-sponsor. Greater access to rights-of-way at reduced costs can help spur the deployment of advanced facilities, not only in urban areas, but also deeper into rural areas. The plan also highlights specific ways in which the Federal Universal Service System can be reformed, and I'm very encouraged by these proposals. The obvious goal is to transform the fund to support broadband networks so that all Americans have access, and I'm encouraged that the FCC is initiating the first of these proceedings in its open meeting that is occurring this morning. I'm also encouraged that Chairman Boucher is working on draft legislation to help achieve this goal, and I'm supportive of his efforts. The plan also recommends addressing the data roaming issue. Consumers will be well served by common sense reform in this area. And finally, I would like to commend the FCC for putting forward a proposed timeline of its implementation schedule for the many proposals in the plan. This is the first time the FCC has so clearly outlined its work schedule, and I think that this approach is consistent with the Chairman's view that the FCC should be as open and transparent as possible. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses.
Thank you very much, Chairman Waxman. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this hearing. I appreciate the panel, and hopefully I'll get a chance to sit into a lot of the discussion. I'm personally conflicted about the broadband plan. I'll try to be a little more calm than I was when the FCC was sitting before us. And there's a couple issues. Whether the number is 7 million or whether it's larger, the real issue is before we deploy, we ought to map. And we didn't do that. And so we have the cart before the horse, so that's issue one. I've been talking numerous times about let's define what the goal is that we're trying to achieve and what speed is going to be the standard. Whether it's 4, 100, whatever, let's get a definition so that we know what we're trying to achieve. We ought to roll out government intervention is only appropriate when we want to target those homes that are otherwise uneconomic for the private sector to serve. I reject this argument that it's government's role to provide a variety of providers. And what we see going on is with government taxpayers' dollars, we are overbuilding in areas, creating a competitive market against incumbent providers already. When we have, at a minimum, 7 million people who don't have access. So those of us who represent rural areas who may be on dial-up, the appropriate place for government money to do is, like we do in the Universal Service Fund, to use government help to roll out to areas that are not economic for an individual entity to do, not to overbuild and compete with other traditional providers right now. So we have a long way to go. We are wasting time and we're wasting money to get deployment out to rural America. So, Mr. Chairman, it's timely, and we will be watching this process as it moves forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shimkus. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingle, Chairman Emeritus of the Energy and Commerce Committee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for convening today's hearing on the last mile broadband development. It is very important. I fully support the important cause of providing all Americans with access to broadband communications. All the same, we must ensure that such federal program implemented to do so is based on accurate data and grounded in appropriate statutes. There seems to be some confusion concerning the actual level of last mile broadband infrastructure deployment and adoption across the United States. I would remind my colleagues that deployment and adoption are not synonymous with one another, and welcome any clarification on this matter our witnesses can provide. As many of them have rightly noted, accurate data is invaluable to the proper design and functioning of any future broadband support mechanism. It is also indispensable to proper administration by the agencies concerned. We must also ascertain whether existing statute is adequate to the task of establishing new and functioning support mechanisms to ensure that all Americans have access to broadband communications. I note that the National Broadband Plan recommends broadening of the Universal Service Fund contribution base. I hope our witnesses, especially Mrs. Gillette of the Federal Communications Commission, will provide the members of this subcommittee with their candid opinions concerning the extent to which the Commission's statutory authority currently permits this. Should it not, I again remind our witnesses that the Congress is the sole progenitor of the Commission's authorities and should be consulted if new powers are to be confirmed or conferred or exercised. In closing, I would like to thank the witnesses for appearing before us this morning to allow the members of the subcommittee to avail themselves of the expertise of our witnesses. To our witnesses' dismay, I am sure I will submit my questions, many of them yes or no, for the record, and ask unanimous consent at this time, Mr. Chairman, that I be permitted so to do. I also look forward to continued debate on this matter and other matters related to the implementation of the National Broadband Plan. I thank you for the courtesy that you've extended me this morning, Mr. Chairman. I commend you for the hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Chairman Dingle. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Griffith, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Imperative that any policies we discuss foster competition. In today's business market, access to broadband is vital from the boardroom to the farm and everywhere in between. I believe that we've been moving in the right direction with the deployment of broadband. Free market principles and pro-investment policies have yielded 200 million subscribers, up from 8 million over the last decade. Over the last 10 years, private industry has invested over $500 billion in broadband deployment. Staggering number, and one that confirms that those investments were vital to reaching the current 200 million subscribers. If we stay on this path and work together, I believe we can meet the goal of providing the remaining 100 million homes with access to broadband service by 2020. Again, I thank you for your time today, and I look forward to hearing your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Griffith. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this very important hearing. Welcome, Bureau Chief Gillette. I've admired your work in Massachusetts over the years, and I'm very proud to have you now take on this great national responsibility. As the lead House sponsor in 1996 of the E-rate provision, I called it the E-rate. I was going to call it the Ed rate, but I didn't think I could get away with it, so I just called it the E-rate. It is important for us to recognize that the children, that adults without broadband should have access, that in schools and in libraries, but increasingly because according to the FCC, 14 to 24 million Americans do not have broadband accessible to them at all, and another 93 million Americans have chosen not to purchase broadband, even if it is available to them. We need strategies that can ensure that broadband does reach them. And so this is a huge issue for us. The OECD has said that we've dropped to 15th in world rankings in broadband deployment. So what I think we have to do is, relying upon this National Broadband Plan to have this discussion, we have to devise ways that we harness new advances in technologies, assist on administrative efficiencies inside of the programs in order to drive down costs and to create savings wherever possible. And we need to shift over time to a more rational, stable source of funding while embracing broadband as a service that all Americans should be entitled to. It will become the indispensable infrastructure for the 21st century in our country and around the world. It will be a proxy for economic growth in all sectors: energy, healthcare, education, all parts of the American economy. If we want to be number one for the 4% of our population as opposed to the other 96% of the world, we just have to decide that broadband is going to be at the center of that national strategy. This hearing will go a long way towards helping us to establish a long-term plan. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Markey. The chair would like to add its welcome also to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta. As a due member of our subcommittee, we look forward to working with you, and you are recognized for 2 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor for me to be on the subcommittee. I look forward to working with you and the other members on the subcommittee. I represent one of the most rural areas in the state of Ohio, and I'm keenly aware of the importance broadband deployment plays in the economic development and in the nexus that this access has to job creation. I feel very strongly that the country's free market private investment approach to broadband expansion has been very successful. It is also my understanding that according to the National Broadband Plan, 95% of the population has at least 4 megabyte per second broadband service. I believe that the remaining 5% stretch for service should be spent on the unserved areas where areas do not have access to broadband. We need to carefully look at how to expand service to ensure that there is not an unfair advantage to one entity, especially in light of the fact that private industry has invested billions of their own capital to expand services. And additionally, I'm concerned how the FCC will define competition with the structure of the plan. Furthermore, the plan has called for greater collection and analysis of the competition data. This is a bit worrisome as companies are essentially being asked to hand over their proprietary data, potentially fuel competition to their services by the government or their private sector counterparts. There must be safeguards put in place and an assurance that the government does not get into the business of competing with this already hyper-competitive industry. It is important that while serving to reach this remaining 5% of the unserved households, that jobs are indeed created. I am critical of increasing bureaucratic red tape through any government initiative when the free market can do better. We need to ensure that any new requirements are not detrimental to job creation in Ohio or across the country. Broadband expansion can help the economy by creating new jobs related to the deployment of necessary infrastructure, as well as by giving unemployed workers access to tools that will help them find and prepare for new jobs. It is my hope that the FCC does indeed focus on broadband employment, which will bring jobs and economic development to rural areas, and not to focus on policy areas where the FCC has questionable authority. I want to thank the Chairman again for this opportunity. I look forward to hearing from the testimony from the witnesses. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Latta. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for scheduling this hearing to continue to explore options for deploying broadband in ways that all Americans, not just some, but all Americans will have access to it. The National Broadband Plan makes inclusion an essential priority, with a goal of reaching, as we know, 100 million households with 100 megabits per second service by 2020. I think that this is an ambitious plan, and I think it's just what we need to do. We need to be ambitious, given, as you stated earlier, our 16th position in the world. We can't afford to leave some Americans in the dust while others move ahead with broadband access in a way that turns the underserved and the unserved regions of our nation into virtual reality ghost towns. I'm pleased that the National Broadband Plan contains ideas already offered by members. I introduced one that would require broadband conduit to be installed for federal highway projects. It's the dig once concept, which is what I call it anyway. And I think it makes sense from the financial and administrative ends. We can guarantee the infrastructure that goes where our highway system goes and reap the cost savings of doing a 2-for-1 dig. And so I hope to see this move. I think it's smart. I think it makes sense. It's pragmatic. And I look forward to seeing it happen. Inclusion and access can't be achieved without funding. And I think that we need to update the Universal Service Fund to recognize broadband as a primary communications tool. Certainly, Representative Matsui's bill moves in that direction. I support it. Mr. Markey's bill, which takes the E-rate program to the next level, I'm proud to support. So I think that we need to build in these pieces of legislation in order to keep moving ahead. Well, we're only going to reach the last mile, in my view, with a unified sense of purpose. As I look out at the witnesses here today, there's a diverse range of interests, and I'm looking forward to hearing how you see us reaching and serving the last mile in a way that is inclusive and affordable. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for continuing this series of hearings. They are most valuable, obviously, on the broadband plan, and I can't wait for the implementation phase. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Eshoo. The gentlelady from the state of Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for the hearing and for the focus that we have on this issue, and I want to say welcome to all of you who are before us today. We are glad you're here. I will have to tell you, if we had been doing our work in the manner in which we should have been, you would not have to be here today. We do need to put our attention on the 7 million people that do not have access to broadband, and that should be the focus of our attention. But we should have gone about our mapping processes first, and then we should have issued the definitions of what unserved and underserved were going to be. Instead, this committee, after much discussion, decided that that would be booted to the FCC, who then decided they would boot it on to others. So we need to look at where we are placing the ability to determine what this is. Now, do local governments have a role to play in this? They do, but they don't need to be competing with private companies. That is why we need to be looking at these definitions and then making a determination how we go about with completing the rest of this broadband access, but not driving up cost for the consumer. I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say, and welcome to the committee. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Blackburn. The gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Boucher and Ranking Member Stearns, for the second hearing on the National Broadband Plan. As a representative of a district that is second to last in broadband penetration, the implementation of the last mile is very important to my constituents, as it is to tribal areas and many communities of color, who I'm sure make up much of the 14 to 24 million Americans to whom broadband is unavailable, or the 93 million or more who are not using it. These communities are at a health, educational, and economic disadvantage, and so the optimal deployment of the last mile, as well as the middle mile, and efforts to increase adoption are critical if our communities are to thrive and our nation is to remain competitive. I think that the National Broadband Plan's recommendation to expand the Universal Service Program to cover broadband and the expansion of the Community Connect program are a great start. I look forward to the discussions on these and other recommendations during this hearing. And while I recognize that this hearing is not specifically on BTOP or BIP, they represent an immediate investment opportunity for the territories, many of which are long distances from the mainland and depend greatly on broadband deployment. To date, only 2 grants were awarded to the territories in round 1. It's my hope they'll do better in round 2, because it's important that we get the funding to these areas. I'd also like to welcome our witnesses and look forward to their testimonies and the discussion on broadband funding and deployment today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Christensen. The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and I look forward to the series of hearings that we'll have on the National Broadband Plan. That said, I do hope that the actual last mile wireline and wireless providers will be able to testify in future hearings. They are doing an excellent job according to the plan, which states that approximately 290 million Americans, 95% of the population, have access to at least 4 megabit per second broadband service. If we're going to meet the goals set out in the plan, then it makes sense to have federal programs like the Universal Service Fund concentrate on the small 5% of the unserved population that do not have access to broadband. These homes are primarily in very rural areas in which it is otherwise uneconomic for the private sector to serve. As we have seen by the massive investments made over the last decade, the private sector is more than willing to provide service to the rest of the country. It should come as no surprise to anyone in this room when I say I truly hope that this committee will have the opportunity to advance a much-needed USF reform bill in which the chairman and I have worked so hard on over the years. Again, I thank you, Chairman Boucher, for holding this hearing and look forward to the future hearings, and I yield back the rest of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Terry. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, is recognized for 2 minutes. Thank you. The 2 minutes will be added to your time for questioning our witnesses. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today on deploying broadband to the last mile. While the majority of Americans enjoy access to a fast broadband connection, there is a significant segment that does not. And so my comments today will be for those who do not have access to broadband. Those who fall into that category either use dial-up or simply go without the technology that connects us to the Internet. These unserved and underserved regions should be of the highest concern to those who are charged with fulfilling Congress's intent of nationwide and universal broadband deployment and accessibility. I am concerned at the amount of BTOP and BIP funds that have been awarded to date. Out of the $7.2 billion appropriated to NTIA and RUS, only a little more than $2 billion has been awarded. With a tremendous need, particularly in rural areas like mine, more must be done to expeditiously award qualified applicants. More than a dozen applications came from my district, yet only one statewide middle-mile infrastructure project has been funded. That award will benefit my state by connecting anchor institutions, hospitals, and libraries, but will not benefit my constituents that still lack a home connection. The National Broadband Plan also recommends that municipalities lacking access to affordable broadband fill the void through a municipally owned operator. This is already happening in a municipally owned city in my district, Wilson, North Carolina, where Greenlight, the city's municipally owned broadband, is providing fiber to home for every customer at an affordable cost. The city applied for round one of BTOP funds and was not funded, and it does not qualify for BIP's second round funding. Having invested $30 million of their own money, the city has built a successful world-class system only to be denied federal assistance for its continued operation. Wilson is lucky to have been able to sustain themselves for so long, but other regions of the district simply go without access to the tools that we all take for granted. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I want to thank you for your leadership on this issue. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Butterfield. The gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Stearns. Vermont is intimately familiar with the challenges of last-mile broadband deployment. We've got close to 20% of Vermonters currently lacking access to high-speed broadband, and the majority of Vermont lacks access to state-of-the-art communication tools like Wi-Fi and town centers and mobile television services. So we've got a long way to go. And, of course, in this day and age, access to broadband is no longer a luxury, it's a necessity. And for Vermont and other states like Vermont to compete in the 21st century, we've got to take greater strides towards achieving universal access. And to fail in this effort would be to fail large swaths of rural America, including Vermont. So that is why I support the National Broadband Plan proposed reform of the Universal Service Fund, an expansion of the Community Connect program. We've got to reach that goal of deploying broadband facilities capable of actual download speeds of 4 megabits and upload speeds of 1 megabits to 99% of the unserved population by 2020. I'm hoping to learn more today. I appreciate you being here and all of the work that you're doing, and look forward to getting from where we are to where we need to be as quickly as possible. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Welch. The gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Boucher, for calling this hearing, and welcome to our witnesses. Since the Comcast BitTorrent case, many people have been wondering what's in store for the National Broadband Plan. The plan's overarching mission is very important, and that is to bring the tremendous power of the Internet to all Americans, rural or urban, rich or poor, young or old. So in my view, the last mile is not just about geography. There are millions of Americans, many of them in well-served communities like mine, who simply do not have the resources to take advantage of the world at their fingertips. In addition, the Universal Service Fund has served many telephone users well over the years, but it is time for an update. And the plan aims to reform the USF and bring it into the broadband age, and I'm supportive of these efforts. Many of you have heard me mention before that Floridians over time have paid into the USF much more than we have received back, and we need reform. I want to make sure that the funds are intended for broadband adoption in the new version of the USF are distributed more evenly across communities in the last mile, in the truest sense of that phrase. I'd also like to hear what the witnesses have to say about the FCC's ability to reform the USF in the post-Comcast BitTorrent world. We need to figure out if the FCC has the authority that needs to make changes to how we pay into the USF and expand it to include broadband. Regulatory uncertainty is not good for business, and it's not good for consumers. So now it's time for Congress and the FCC to dig in and do what it takes to bring the real-world infrastructure that gets us to the last mile. Thank you all, and I look forward to your testimony. I go back.
Thank you, Ms. Castor. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the ranking member also. I want to say good morning and welcome to each one of our witnesses here today. I want to thank you for appearing to offer your views on the state of broadband adoption as well as your recommendations on how to best deploy broadband to individuals and families in unserved and underserved areas. In 1989, there was a blockbuster movie produced and directed by Kevin Costner called The Field of Dreams. And Kevin Costner plays our corn farmer, Ray Kinsella, who hears voices that tell him to build, if you would build it, he will come, or they will come. Going on blind faith and his interpretation of what those voices have commanded of him, Ray invests extraordinary measures of time and resources to construct a baseball diamond in his cornfield. Nearly a year later, and following the jeers of neighbors and impending bankruptcy, his vision becomes manifest when the ghosts of 8 Chicago White Sox, including the infamous Shoeless Joe Jackson, appears literally out of thin air to practice and play on that cornfield diamond. The top leaders and management of communications companies have not only told us, but also shown us time and time again that they are not like Ray Kinsella. Unlike Mr. Kinsella, they are not novices in business. Unlike Mr. Kinsella, these business leaders are driven by the prospects of generating hard cash assets and handsome returns for their shareholders. And unfortunately, unlike Ray, some of these companies have lost touch with the visions of their own founders to be content with modest profits while erring on the side of consistently growing their networks through all economic cycles. Just a generation or two ago, a large percentage of these companies and even public utilities were owned by wider bases of shareholders. Many of these shareholders held but a few shares of stock in a given company and were content to know that their investments would provide them with predictable income and stable dividends. These wide bases have shrunken increasingly over the years, and the structure of these companies have been reorganized so as to avoid or to minimize their public interest obligations and duties under the law. They are now comprised of smaller and smaller groups of extremely wealthy individuals and giant financial institutions whose interests in expanding their networks are inseparable from what the last few sets of quarterly profits on these companies' income statements show. Therein lies the rub, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. How can we find that sweet spot where network expansion and broadband deployment intersect with the profit motives of emerging and mature communications companies alike? And I will be listening intently to what the witnesses have to say today in their testimony, and during the question and answer period to hear how best Congress can promote the laudable goal of the National Broadband Plan, deploying broadband facilities to 99% of the unserved population by the year 2020. We're in 2010 now. 10 years isn't a lot of time. Let's start talking, let's start working, let's start making it happen. Thank you. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rush. The gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. I just want to note where the longest last mile is, which is into tribal communities, and hope that we can discuss ways to advance finishing that longest last mile. We've got infrastructure challenges. We've got government relationship challenges. We've had some good progress with 57 tribes out in Washington. I think there's things we can do, and I hope we'll talk about ways to get that done today. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Inslee. The gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, these are obviously concerns that we share even in urban districts, as I discussed at the last hearing. And with that, I'll submit my opening statement and look forward to the testimony.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. DeGette. We will add 2 minutes to your time for questioning our panel of witnesses. We turn now to our panel, and I want to welcome each of them. I will say just a brief word of introduction about each, and then we'll be very pleased to hear from you. Sharon Gillette is the chief of the Wireline Competition Bureau at the Federal Communications Commission and was a participant in the construction of the National Broadband Plan. David Bolano is the assistant administrator of the telecommunications program at Rural Development at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Joe Garcia is the regional vice president for the National Congress of American Indians. Derek Turner is a research director for Free Press. Mark Dankberg is the chairman and CEO of Viasat Incorporated. Austin Carroll is the general manager of the Hopkinsville Electric System from Hopkinsville, Kentucky. And Jeffrey Eisenach is the managing director and principal for Navigant Economics, LLC. We welcome each of you this morning, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be inserted in the record. We would welcome your oral summaries and ask that you try to keep those to approximately 5 minutes. Ms. Gillette, we're glad to have you here. Congratulations on a fine work with the broadband plan, and we look forward to hearing from you. And if you could pull that microphone as close as possible, we can hear you better. Turn it on, and
aha.
There we go. All the technical experts we have here have challenges with our technology. It's always interesting. All right, I'm sorry. Glad to hear you.
Thank you, Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Stearns, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify today about broadband deployment as described in the National Broadband Plan. I am also submitting a technical paper that the FCC is publishing on this topic, and I request that it be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. As you know, the plan stems from a congressional directive to ensure that all people in the U.S. have access to broadband capability. To meet that objective, the FCC needed to size the gap between current broadband deployment levels and the goal of deployment to everyone. Given the limited state of available data on broadband deployment, sizing the gap was not a simple task. It involved considerable effort to gather the best available data and incorporate it into a comprehensive model of the current status of broadband deployment. This model considers a housing unit to have access to broadband capability if it is close enough to today's telephone or cable network infrastructure, such that a service provider can deliver broadband at actual speeds of 4 megabits per second download and 1 megabit per second upload today. The model estimates that 95% of the housing units in the U.S. can be served from today's infrastructure, meaning that about 14 million Americans cannot be served. Just because a housing unit can be served, however, does not mean that it is. There's no guarantee that a provider makes a retail service available to every home that its network is capable of serving. As a result, the actual number of citizens who cannot purchase broadband service is likely higher than 14 million. Limitations in the model data sources also contribute to sensitivities in the 95% estimate. For example, we relied on public cable industry data, which estimates that 90% of housing units are reachable with cable-based broadband. This data attributes cable broadband availability to entire cable franchise areas if any part of the franchise area is served with two-way capability. This attribution is accurate in most, but not all cases, and accordingly, the 90% figure may be an overstatement. The plan's estimate of an additional 5% of housing units that are reachable only through telephone-based broadband is similarly based on limited data. The model relied on data for a number of states as an input to a statistical regression analysis that allowed us to adapt the conclusions from these states to the rest of the nation. And I will add that exactly because of the kinds of concerns raised by the Chairman Boucher, we did not rely on Virginia data as one of the states. As is generally the case, though, with statistical extrapolation, the results are estimates rather than exact figures. As a complement to the broadband infrastructure modeling effort, we also analyzed FCC broadband subscribership data, recognizing that such analysis is an imperfect means of assessing broadband availability. This analysis suggests that 92% of Americans live in areas where broadband service is offered, meaning that as many as 24 million Americans live in areas where broadband service is not offered. Based on these two methods of sizing the broadband deployment gap, we conclude that broadband is unavailable to approximately 14 to 24 million Americans. The model developed for the plan also estimates the financial commitments needed to reach unserved homes and the likely resulting revenues. This financial modeling showed that for today's unserved homes, which are largely located in low-density rural areas, the private sector business case to reach them simply does not add up. While the market has done a great job of getting broadband to much of America, market incentives alone will not be enough to reach the homes that remain unserved today. Just as the current Universal Service Fund was instrumental in ensuring the availability of telephone service to over 99% of Americans, so too will a financial commitment to universal broadband service be necessary to ensure that broadband availability surpasses 95% in the future. Two helpful developments should improve data on the unserved. First, as a result of the Broadband Data Improvement Act, states are now gathering data about broadband deployment, and by next February, this data will be integrated into a national broadband map. Second, later this year, the FCC will propose revisions to its broadband data gathering methodology, consistent with recommendations in the plan. We look forward to working with Congress, industry representatives, and public interest advocates to fashion a new regime of broadband data collection that will provide Congress and the FCC with the relevant data we need while respecting industry's concerns regarding data that is legitimately competitively sensitive. Allow me to conclude by sharing with you that when I served as a state commissioner, lack of broadband availability was the top constituent complaint for legislators from rural districts. And now, such complaints are the most frequent correspondence I receive from members of this august body. The addresses are all over the country, but the issues are the same. In homes without broadband, children are at an educational disadvantage. Parents are shut out from jobs that require online applications, and no one can access critical government information and services online. If you live in one of those homes, it matters little to you whether broadband is available to 90, 92, or 95% of Americans. What matters most is that broadband is not available to 100% of the home that you live in. And solving that problem lies at the heart of the National Broadband Plan and reflects the very core of the FCC's mission in the 21st century to work to make sure that America has world-leading, high-speed broadband networks. Thank you again for inviting me to testify, and I'll be happy to address any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gillette. Mr. Villano.
Thank you. Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Stearns.
And if you could pull that microphone even a little closer, that would be good. Thank you.
Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Stearns, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Department of Agriculture's broadband programs, and specifically USDA's Community Connect grant program, administered by our Rural Utility Service. We appreciate the work and support you and members of Congress have provided to help build a strong, dependable, and affordable broadband infrastructure in rural areas. Rural development is truly committed to the future of rural communities. Throughout my 33-year career with rural development, I have worked in virtually all of its programs, including business, housing, community facilities, and most recently our telecommunication programs. My career began in the field, and since coming to our national office in Washington, D.C., I have seen firsthand the tremendous impact that our investments make in rural communities. In my current position, I'm responsible for all rural development telecommunication programs, and I can think of no program more fundamental to the future of rural America. The expansion of advanced telecommunication networks strengthens our nation's economy and its growth. Yet in our rural communities, internet use trails that of urban areas. At Russ, we view modern broadband infrastructure investment in rural economic competitiveness and a fundamental building block of sustaining economic development. Communities lacking access to modern broadband service are at a severe disadvantage. During the past 60 years, RUS has provided nearly $19 billion in loans and grants to build communication infrastructure in rural communities across the United States. Since 1995, all Russ-financed telecommunication facilities have been broadband capable. Our broadband loan program, created by the 2002 Farm Bill, has provided over $1.1 billion in loans to more than 90 broadband projects in rural communities spanning 42 states. Our distance learning and telemedicine program, also part of the 2002 Farm Bill, provides loans and grants for educational opportunities and healthcare services such as computer networks, telemedicine capabilities, electronic medical records, and interactive educational facilities to rural communities. To date, our distance learning and telemedicine program has funded nearly 1,000 projects in over 40 states, totaling $400 million. In 2009, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act provided an additional $2.5 billion for broadband loans and grants. The Recovery Act allows USDA to provide a flexible mix of loans, grants, and loan grant combinations, similar to our water and community facility programs, which will make more projects in unserved areas feasible and eligible for funding. Our Community Connect grant program was created in 2002 to meet the needs of totally unserved areas. Community Connect provides grants to eligible applicants to establish broadband service on a community-oriented connectivity basis. Broadband service funded through the program must foster economic growth and deliver enhanced educational, healthcare, and public safety services. Community Connect has provided more than $98 million in funds to provide broadband services in 197 unserved communities, including some of the lowest income, neediest, and often highest cost to serve areas of the nation. 25% of them have gone to tribal areas. The demand for our Community Connect program has been considerable. Last year alone, Russ received over 200 applications requesting over $200 million for the $13 million that we had available. An excellent example of the impact of the Community Connect program is a grant awarded to Sacred Wind Communications. This $436,000 Community Connect grant, made in 2005, funded broadband service for the community of Herfino, New Mexico on the Navajo Reservation. Today, Navajos of all ages come to the center to use the computers to check their email, perform searches, job hunt, do homework assignments, play educational games, apply to college, and to meet with others for social and e-commerce business purposes. In October of 2009, American Express announced that Sacred Wind Communications was voted the most inspiring small business in America in the company's Shine a Light contest. This is but one example of how Community Connect serves as a catalyst for sustainable broadband adoption in rural areas. There's no single solution to the complicated mission of bringing advanced telecommunication services to every citizen. Government incentives, cost support mechanisms, changes in technology, and private investment all play a role. The $98 million invested through our Community Connect program is just one tool in the toolbox to achieve the administration and Congress's broadband policy goals. As the most long-standing direct federal grant program to promote rural broadband, Community Connect is worthy of further study to draw lessons learned not only in terms of broadband deployment, but in the impact on economic development, healthcare opportunities, education, and other key indicators of the vibrancy of local communities. These lessons can be applied to the analysis of the much larger investments now being undertaken through the Recovery Act to promote broadband throughout the United States. Rural communities will always face challenges of competing economically, but they are stronger today because of the partnership forward at USDA's Rural Development. It's an honor and a privilege to work with you and our federal partners throughout the Obama administration to make affordable broadband service widely available throughout rural America. Thank you again for inviting me here to testify. I'll be glad to address any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Villano. Mr. Garcia.
Senor Tomo, good morning. I'm Joe Garcia, and I'm the current chairman of the All Indian Public Council in New Mexico, and also the Area Vice President representing the National Congress of American Indians, also former president of the National Congress. Chairman Balcher, Ranking Member Stearns, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to provide this testimony on the great potential of the National Broadband Plan to serve Indian country. Today, some 90% of Native Americans living in Indian country do not have affordable or reliable high-speed access to the Internet. The economic, cultural, and human significance of that fact cannot be underestimated. Connecting Indian country with the world can reverse centuries of isolation and neglect. In the National Broadband Plan, however, Indian country was not an afterthought. Concepts such as the tribal-centric, deployment models, and core community institutions are now becoming part of the FCC's vocabulary. The FCC now understands that carriers have often stopped at the borders of Indian country, and why tribes often find themselves as the only ones willing to make the commitment to provide these services to their citizens. These lessons have taught us an important fact about telecom and Indian country. Deployment must be sustainable before it can ever hope to be profitable. The submission of the plan to Congress is only the beginning of this process. This morning, I would like to highlight 5 of its recommendations. Our written testimony also expands beyond the comments here today. First and foremost, the plan recommends that Congress establish a tribal broadband fund to bring services to tribal headquarters and other anchor institutions, as well as assisting tribes in deployment planning, infrastructure build-out, feasibility studies, technical assistance, business plan development and implementation, digital literacy, and outreach. Only a new separate fund will ensure that broadband is actually deployed in Indian country. The existing BIP and the BTOP programs, funded at $7.2 billion, will not be sufficient to close the broadband availability gap. While a handful of tribal projects receive funding from the Recovery Act, it will take an additional $1.2 to $4.6 billion specifically targeted for the Tribal Broadband Fund to begin to close the digital divide. Second, and equally important, is the creation of the FCC Office of Tribal Affairs. To be credible and effective, the FCC must give the office sufficient resources, authority, and jurisdiction over communications issues affecting Indian country. Congress must increase funding for the FCC's Indian telecom initiatives so that it can genuinely develop and drive a tribal agenda. This new office should be an effective instrument of the FCC and voice for tribal nations in Washington. Third, the Universal Fund should be reformed with a special emphasis on the unique nature of Indian country. For instance, a library in Indian country may be different from what a library looks like elsewhere, but that is no reason to deny support. Indian schools need support not only for their classrooms, but also for their dormitories, where children need the internet to study. And as sovereign nations, tribes need a seat at the table for ETC designations for USF support. In changing USF, however, Congress must not inadvertently cut the only wire going into Indian country. The current analog telephone high cost and tribal lifeline and link-up programs are vital to Indian country and must not be negatively affected. To assist with this transition, we also urge Congress to establish a tribal seat on the USF Federal-State Joint Board. Fourth, tribes need spectrum. Spectrum that is often in the hands of licensees that have not used it to bring service to Indian country. The FCC should remain dormant spectrum and make it available to tribes who actually deliver services. This must be more than just unregulated or white space spectrum. It must consider dormant licensed spectrum as well. Finally, we urge congressional support for the adoption of a tribal priority to address the many barriers to entry. The tribal priority that was recently adopted by the FCC for broadcast spectrum is well-grounded in strong constitutional principles based on the political status of tribal nations as sovereign entities. A new tribal priority should be used with reclaimed spectrum to ensure that it is actually used for broadband services to tribal lands, but it should also be used by the FCC beyond spectrum to barriers across the Commission's rules. At this point, I'd like to just say that at Okeowinge is a place called the Place of the Strong People. We live 25 miles from the state capital of New Mexico, Santa Fe. The Los Alamos National Lab, where I retired from, exists just 25 miles away. And yet, our little community had no access to internet. A phone company was there, but it only brought DSL services and my brother lived less than 1/8 mile away from where I live. And he had DSL. I didn't have DSL. But we took that opportunity and say we need access. And so we went and did a proposal to USDA some years ago. We got funded, and now we have wireless service in our community, thanks to our own efforts and to the funding from USDA. But that is really what life is about in this country, is that if you live in the rural areas and remote areas, that's where the non-access is the biggest culprit for America. While new congressional funding and actions are essential, there will be a strong return on your investment by engaging tribal governments and their community institutions, by taking a tribal-centric approach to deployment, by digging once, and by sharing infrastructure efficiently. Federal funding will produce a bountiful return and will actually save money in the long run. In closing, there's one important benefit that I cannot fail to mention, and that is the sense of empowerment that broadband can bring. The ability to shape one's own future, to provide a better world for new generations, is an important part of what we mean by tribal sovereignty. The National Congress of American Indians looks forward to continuing our mutually beneficial relationship with the FCC and Congress as we all work to implement effectively the National Broadband Plan while finally moving Indian country to the forefront of technology. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. Mr. Turner.
Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Stearns, and members of the committee, I thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the important issue of the FCC's National Broadband Plan. I'm the Research Director for Free Press, a public interest organization dedicated to public education and consumer advocacy on communications policy. We have for years worked to ensure that the principles and goals in the Communications Act are translated through the public policy process into a reality for all Americans. Thus, we welcomed the call for the FCC to produce a national broadband plan, and we were very pleased that Congress requested the plan contain an evaluation of the status of broadband deployment. Good data is a requirement for good policy. And as Congress has recognized, for too long, policymakers have not had the right data to understand the problems in our broadband market. But as important as quality data is, it is equally important that the information be presented in a way where all the caveats, assumptions, and uncertainties are made extremely clear. Congress asked that the National Broadband Plan evaluate the status of broadband deployment. And despite a valiant effort, I think that the information presented to Congress in the plan, particularly the way it is presented, overstates the actual availability of broadband service in America. In particular, the information presented in the plan serves to understate the magnitude of the underserved broadband problem, implying that high-quality services are offered in most rural areas when we know that they probably are not. This is partly the result of some questionable assumptions that underlie the data, but at a high level, it is the result of an unfortunate presentation of the information that can be misleading. The National Broadband Plan reports that 95% of U.S. housing units have access to broadband infrastructure capable of supporting actual download speeds of at least 4 megabits per second and actual upload speeds of at least 1 megabit per second, a service quality threshold which is the plan's national availability target. This finding is presented prominently in this map in the broadband plan, a figure with the title Availability of 4 megabits per second capable broadband networks in the United States. Now, when I hear the word availability, or I'm told that something is available, I think that means that I could get the item or service because someone is offering it. But the plan's 95% available 4 megabit finding is not supported by data on what services are actually being offered. No, the finding is largely based on the assumption that where cable services are, such infrastructure is capable of delivering broadband service at this quality. But this is like saying, if I build a grocery store on top of a mountain that is served by a forest road, bread is therefore available in my store, because that forest road gives me the capability of bringing bread there. But if I have no bread on the shelf, or if the bread is stale, the customers won't much care that I had the capability of getting it there. The problems with this estimate only serve to highlight the fact that the FCC currently lacks adequate information on the actual state of broadband availability, despite years of public and congressional pleas for better data. This need not be the case. The Commission has for nearly 2 years failed to act on its own proposal to collect broadband availability data. And now, Despite the fact that the National Broadband Plan strongly recommends that the FCC finally gather this data, the Commission has signaled its intent to delay the matter even further by starting another proceeding all the way at the end of this year. As I said at the start, good data is a requirement for good policy, but so too is a strong commitment to efficiency and good ideas in the face of entrenched interests. The National Broadband Plan does set out a plausible vision for modernizing the Universal Service Fund, one that Free Press generally supports. However, this USF transition plan still leaves in place many of the more problematic aspects of the existing subsidy system, including the lack of a determination of where subsidies are actually needed to keep rates at a quality and a reasonably comparable rate. Also, the plan proposes to bring unserved areas 2010 era technology, but not until 2020. This raises concerns whether these networks will be scalable to reach future universal service goals. If we follow such a path, we may ultimately end up just replacing one form of the digital divide with another, where urban Americans have world-class quality networks while rural America is stuck with second-class access. In closing, as Congress moves forward with the oversight of the National Broadband Plan and with its own ideas on universal service reform, it should be aware of all the caveats in the data. Policymakers need the right information to ensure our broadband infrastructure challenges are met in the most efficient manner possible. I thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Turner. Mr. Dankberg. Yes, pull it as close as you can. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Stearns, and the members of the committee. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present. I'm Mark Dankberg. I'm co-founder of Viasat, Inc. It's a company I started in my house about 24 years ago. It's grown to have about 2,000 employees all around the country, and for the last 10 years, we've been very focused on bringing broadband to America by satellite. We're close to $1 billion company, and we provide this technology all around the world. We're investing about $1 billion over the starting 2 years ago to do this. And I wanted to cite famous American Will Rogers, who, believe it or not, is a broadband expert. When Will Rogers said, "It's not the things that you don't know that'll hurt you. It's the things you think are so, but ain't. It's what you think is true, but ain't so." Boy, I always get that one. Okay, so let's go back. I'm going to tell you 3 things that you think are so, and that you think are true and ain't so. One is that lack of availability of broadband is primarily a rural problem. I'm going to show you evidence from our subscribers where they are, that it's actually, there are far more people in Ohio, Virginia, New York, California without broadband than there are in Wyoming and Montana. There are more people, the higher percentages in the rural states, but more people in the developed states. Number 2, that we think it is good business to serve people who don't have broadband available. That's what we're doing, we're investing in. And third, that satellite actually can provide a very good service. It's not a second-rate service. So the first thing is this map. Here we show the state of Virginia. The green areas are areas that are mapped to have availability of one or more terrestrial broadband services. Yet, Wild Blue, which has over 400,000 subscribers, more than half of our subscribers in the state of Virginia are in areas that are supposed to have broadband available. It's strong empirical evidence that shows exactly what we've been talking about, that the availability of broadband does not extend to all people. These people, 90% of our subscribers tell us that they can't get terrestrial broadband, even those people that are in these areas that are green. Now, this means that it's a much tougher problem. It's not a problem just in rural areas. It's a problem around cities. The next map shows Ohio, and you can see it's almost the same thing. Those green areas, all the blue dots are subscribers who have gotten satellite because they can't get terrestrial broadband, even in those areas. So you can imagine that if we think we're going to try to serve all of these unserved people, we would essentially be building out infrastructure throughout the state of Ohio, not just in the rural areas. So satellite is actually an excellent way to provide broadband to these scattered people, whether they're in rural areas or around metro areas. This next chart shows basically how people use the internet, and I wanted to make that point. See if we could move to the next chart, please. It's a pie chart, and it shows data from Cisco Systems that shows what the applications are that people use on the internet. And you can see it's dominated by 3 things: video, web and email, and peer-to-peer. For those services, which make up 95% of internet access, satellite is actually an excellent service. We also can provide gaming services. We can provide voice and video services. And to correct sort of misperceptions, I'd like to show a quick 40-second clip. I wish we could demonstrate it here, but this is a 40-second slice-of-life clip of an actual satellite internet session showing people doing voice, video communications, and web browsing that I think will be really illuminating. If we could move to that, please. I think we might have to adjust the volume a little bit. If you could turn up the volume, please.
Hey, Carrie.
Hey, Dave. How are you?
I'm doing well. Did you check out the playoff highlights on Sports Illustrated today?
No, I haven't. Let me check it out real quick. What exactly am I looking for?
Yeah, go to the NBA tab, and there's a great article by Chris Ballard. It's about Kobe Bryant and how he thinks the Thunder have a chance of stopping him to get past the first round of the playoffs.
Oh, yeah, Dave, I've already read this. This is old news. You should really check out ESPN's coverage. It's much better.
Oh, okay, I'll check it out.
So the point being that it should just look like an internet session, and it is. It's just like any internet session that you would have on cable or fiber optics, except that it's done over satellite. And the point that we're trying to make is that this is far, far more cost effective. The next slide just show when people talk about thousands of dollars to build out or tens of thousands of dollars to build out services. Using satellite, it's basically $5 is the cost to make satellite available to any place in our coverage area. We provide service at $49 a month, and if people elect service, the service quality that you saw on that video clip, which we believe is very, very comparable to cable or terrestrial broadband, would cost less than $1,000 to provision at the level that you saw in that video clip. We also make that available on a wholesale basis for less than half that $49 price to retailers including Dish TV, DirecTV, the National Rural Telecom Cooperative, Qwest, and AT&T. We think the FCC properly noted that this can be a good service. What they said is satellite with these next generation satellites, such as the ones that we're offering, can make service available to any American. All they question is whether this is a scalable solution. I want to point out it would take about 7 satellites, that's it, 7 next-generation satellites to make that service available to 7 million subscribers anywhere in the United States. There are already, there are already 5 first-generation satellites that are up. They're not as good as the one that we're launching now, but they indicate the level of investment private industry has already made. Go to the next slide, please. There are 2 of these next-generation satellites currently under construction. Ours will be available 1 year from now, and will make the level of service that you saw available to approximately 1 to 1.5 million people in our coverage area. And just by comparison, next please, there's 25 existing satellites just for satellite TV over the United States today. So the main 3 points that I'd like to make at the end is we do believe private industry can deal with this. If the government feels, though, that the subsidy should be used next, please, what we'd say is that it should be technology neutral to let this very cost-effective technology be one of the alternatives. We recommend that it be competitive, that the way you compete is to provide equal service at the lowest cost, and that the other important point is that the consumers should have choice, that they shouldn't be forced to get service from a particular subscriber because one company has been chosen as the designated entity in that area. And if there weren't, if you look at it,
Mr. Dankberg, you're well over your allotted
time
time here. Can you just wrap up quickly, please?
We're just going to say there are 30 million satellite homes that get TV in the U.S. Nobody would think people would use satellite for TV.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dankberg. Mr. Carroll.
Good morning, Chairman. Good morning, Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Stearns, and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me.
Hold that microphone as close as
Thank you for allowing me to be here. My name is Austin Carroll. I'm General Manager of Hopkinsville Electric System in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. I'm testifying today on behalf of the American Public Power Association, where I serve on the Board of Directors and the Kentucky Municipal Utilities Association, as well as my position at Hopkinsville Electric System. APPA is a national service organization that represents the interests of more than 2,000 publicly owned, not-for-profit electric utilities located in all states except Hawaii. Exhibit 1 in your materials is a map showing the location of the APPA members nationwide. Many of these utilities developed in communities that were literally left in the dark during the era when the United States was electrified, as the private sector electric companies pursued opportunities in larger population areas. State and local governments, therefore, undertook the effort to ensure that residents of their community were served by their own power systems in recognition of the fact that electricity is critical to the economic development and educational opportunities and quality of life for its residents. Currently, over 70% of APPA's members are communities with less than 10,000 population. And approximately 45 million Americans receive their electricity from public power systems. Many of the public power systems were established primarily as the large utilities were unwilling to serve smaller communities in rural areas, which were then viewed as unprofitable. In these cases, communities formed public power systems to do for themselves what the private sector was either unable or unwilling to do at a fair price. The same trend is occurring today in the area of broadband and advanced communications. Many public power systems are meeting the new age demands of their communities by providing broadband services where such services are unavailable or inadequate or too expensive. These services, provided with high quality and affordable prices, are crucial to the economic success and quality of life of communities across the nation. Nationwide, 700 public power utilities provide broadband services to school districts, local governments, hospitals, and almost 200 provide internet services to the residents. Municipal utilities are nonprofit and do not provide dividends for stockholders. In Kentucky, they pay wages that are comparable to that paid by the state of Kentucky. Many public power systems have secured loans or utilized municipal bonds to invest in infrastructure for broadband. Municipal utilities are locally owned and operated utilities that are governed by elected municipal councils or independent utility boards appointed by elected mayors. Thus, unlike the large private sector broadband providers, municipalities' sole focus is the need of their own small territories, and they are responsible to the residents of the residents through the electoral process. It is not my purpose to criticize private sector telephone and cable companies in broadband investment and deployment pricing decisions, but rather to illustrate the differences these companies and municipal power utilities that deploy broadband services. This testimony focuses on broadband services provided by Kentucky municipalities, which I think will provide a particularly useful example of the important role public power utilities have to play in making broadband available nationwide. And I've included a map of Kentucky so you can see the municipalities in Kentucky and the ones providing broadband services. In May of 1998, our community board of directors agreed to run fiber optic cable to our substations around town in order to monitor these substations for electric outage prevention. Then in 99, we had ringed our city on the basis of ringing these substations with fiber optic infrastructure. At that time, broadband was not available in Hopkinsville. Recognizing the need for our community to participate in the global economy and have available all educational opportunities, HES elected to use our fiber infrastructure to provide broadband services to local businesses, industries, government entities, and others needing high-speed communications. We formed a subsidiary, EnergyNet, to manage that, and we keep separate books on the EnergyNet side as opposed to the electric side. Bandwidth at reasonable prices quickly became a popular entity in our community. Kentucky Derby Hosiery, an international sock company, was our first customer, and after that, city buildings, emergency operations centers, fire stations, police stations were connected. All schools were connected as well, and by becoming a USAC-approved provider of E-rate services, we were able to reimburse the school system 80% of its costs of connectivity. So most major businesses in town are now connected over our system. We now have also employed a mesh network of radio transmission across our city, and that's our solution for the residential sector of Hopkinsville. We have continued to grow. We have built a network operations center. It's a very hardened facility, unlike anything else in our community. And we have several of our industries, the hospital and so forth, that locate their servers there for security. And Hopkinsville was initially handicapped because we didn't have a point of presence for a long distance company. And so it was very expensive to try to get broadband at wholesale prices into our community. We've now constructed a line to Bowling Green, Kentucky, where there was a point of presence, and we've dropped our megabit cost from $125 to $20, which that savings has been passed along to our consumers. But we now have a world-class system in Hopkinsville. We can provide broadband at prices that are competitive with major cities. I call them NFL cities, and we're hoping to be able to attract a large data center to our community because we've got all the resources to do so. So it's not only a service to our existing business and industry, but as an economic tool as well. And I appreciate your allowing me to make these comments, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Carroll. Mr. Eisenhower.
Mr. Boucher, Mr. Stern, members of the subcommittee, thank you for having me here today. We'll move quickly to stay on time. The first point I'd like to make is that America's current broadband policies are by and large succeeding. Availability is increasing, prices are falling, adoption is rising, and high rates of investment and innovation ensure that these trends will continue. Our policies can be improved, and the National Broadband Plan contains some good ideas for doing so. But we could also make things worse, in particular by imposing radical and unwarranted new regulations. I'll circle back to these policy issues in a minute, but first let me describe what I consider to be some clear indicators that our broadband policies are producing good results. And I've got some slides, if we can go ahead and put the first one up. First, as the National Broadband Plan itself points out, approximately 19 out of 20 American households have access to one or more wireline providers today, and even more, all but about 2%, have access to one or more providers offering 3G wireless services. Second, and as the next slide shows, broadband prices are dropping and speeds are increasing. Most importantly, from the perspective of broadband adoption, the price per megabit for entry-level plans has fallen by about 75% since 2004. I'll just pause for a second and emphasize the price of entry-level broadband services per megabit in the United States has fallen by 74% in the last 5 years. That's a success story. Third, as the next slide shows, broadband adoption in the U.S. has reached nearly 70% of households and is continuing to expand. And as the next slide shows, and importantly, adoption is rising most rapidly in demographic groups where it has been lowest in the past, with adoption rates rising by 58% among those aged 65 or above, 40% for low-income households, and 21% for rural households between 2008 and 2009. Now, these positive results, as the next slide suggests, are a function of the high levels of mainly private investment in America's broadband infrastructure. Between 2008 and 2014, analysts estimate that private firms will invest over $450 billion in Americans' communications infrastructure, of which more than half, $244 billion, will be dedicated to broadband. In fact, as the next slide indicates, perhaps the strongest indicator that our broadband policies are working lies in the fact that investment in communications equipment has performed quite strongly even during this recent recession, whereas private fixed investment overall is down nearly 25% since 2006. Investment in communications equipment is up by nearly 10%. These data are important because they refute a storyline some interest groups are pushing, which is that our policies have failed and are in need of radical change in the form of massive new regulatory schemes known as net neutrality and mandatory unbundling. Complete discussion of these issues would take more time we have here today, but let me be clear about this. Whatever else one thinks about these proposals, there is simply no question that they would reduce investment and slow deployment of broadband infrastructure, which is what we're here talking about today. Now, let me turn to the National Broadband Plan's proposals for expanding broadband availability and reforming the Universal Service Program, the thrust of which I strongly support. In particular, the Commission is, in my view, absolutely right to focus universal service subsidies on areas where there is not, in the absence of a subsidy, a viable business case for private sector deployment. That is, areas which would otherwise be unserved. Further, the Commission's proposals to save about $15.5 billion by phasing out funding to competitive eligible telecommunications carriers and reducing funding to other high-cost programs are long overdue. I would also suggest the Commission take a hard look at areas where cable firms offer unsubsidized voice service. If a cable company can offer telephone service at reasonable rates without a subsidy, then a phone company ought to be able to do so as well. My own research suggests that the Commission could save another $6 to $10 billion over the next decade by simply eliminating subsidies to telephone companies where unsubsidized cable companies are providing service in the same areas. The Commission also, in my view, needs to take out a sharper pencil when it comes to new spending. Its estimate of a $24 billion availability gap is based on two assumptions that deserve a very hard look. First, this figure apparently assumes that 4G wireless deployments will not count as meeting broadband availability goals, even though the Commission says it believes 4G systems will cover 5 of the 7 million currently unserved housing units. Second, it also assumes that we will extend terrestrial broadband capacity to the 250,000 most costly to serve housing units in the U.S. for a total cost of $14 billion. That's an average of $56,000 per housing unit. Is that something we are really going to do? It may be more than the houses are worth. When these factors are taken into account, it would appear that the broadband availability gap is far smaller and the opportunity for savings from current USF programs is far greater than the plan currently suggests. And this suggests, in turn, to go to my final slide, that the plan's current objective of merely not increasing the USF contribution factor, which, as this slide shows, stands at an all-time high of 15.3%, is not sufficiently ambitious. Let me close by complimenting the Commission on its commitment to a data-driven, fact-based approach to policymaking and by urging it to continue that approach as it moves forward. As a start, I know we are all anxiously awaiting the release of the underlying analyses upon which the plan's recommendations are based, and I gather we may have some of those been released today, at which point it may make sense to revisit much of what's being discussed here. Mr. Chairman, that completes my opening remarks. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Eisenack, and thanks to all of our witnesses for sharing their views with us here this morning. I was very pleased to note that the broadband plan endorses expanding the Community Connect program, and I was glad to hear you testify about that, Mr. Villano, during your presentation. Community Connect, I think, has done a terrific job in making broadband available in communities that, for whatever reason, the private sector has found it to be uneconomic to serve. Oftentimes, these are remote communities where the cost of providing the middle-mile connection in order to bring broadband into that community is prohibitive for the private sector when considering the number of subscribers who might be there to pay for those very large costs. And Community Connect has filled that gap very well. The problem is the program, as useful as it is, only had $13 million to spend for the entire country in the course of the last year. I have seen the benefits of that program in my district. I was glad to hear Mr. Welsh mention in his opening statement that the program has benefited Vermont, and I know it's benefited other countries. The broadband plan endorses it and says it ought to be expanded. Can you suggest, Mr. Villano, ways in which that could be done? And specifically, let me begin by asking you if there are currently any statutory limitations on your ability to expand it, apart from just having adequate appropriations. In other words, if more money were appropriated for this program, could you spend that, or would you have to have some amendment to your authorizing statute in order to enable you to do so?
Thank you, Chairman Boucher. No, I don't believe that there's any statutory impediments to increasing the funding for the program. A lot of what we're doing under the Broadband Initiatives program through the Recovery Act serves a lot of these same unserved communities. So there isn't anything statutorily that would do that.
And has your agency, do you have the capability should additional appropriations be provided for Community Connect to spend those funds effectively?
I definitely believe so, that we have that capability. We are delivering $2.5 billion through the Recovery Act. Right now, once we get through those funds, we'd be more than able to handle an increase in any appropriation under Community Connect.
Is the methodology of Community Connect in any manner assisting you in expending your broadband funds?
It definitely was a
through
help.
the stimulus program?
We have many tools in our toolbox. We have our existing broadband program, the Farm Bill program, our infrastructure program. So certainly many of the lessons that we learned in Community Connect were brought forward to the Broadband Initiatives program. And if we do receive increased appropriations for Community Connect, we would want to look at some of the requirements that we do have for the program.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I think there's a general consensus on the part of most of the witnesses today that the 95% estimate that the broadband plan makes about the availability of broadband nationwide is somewhat optimistic, and that number in all likelihood is lower than that. What can we do to get better data than the Commission had when it made that projection? Mr. Turner, you alluded to some possible approaches. Would you like to expand on that?
Certainly. Mr. Chairman, right now the FCC collects very, very detailed subscribership data broken down by speed tier, residential versus business from every single broadband provider in the country, and they collect that twice a year. And they've been collecting such data, similar data, for almost a decade now. But during that process, they have failed to actually ask the service providers, please define your service territory areas and tell us what quality services are available where. And this is a much easier effort than the filing of subscribership data every 6 months, because basically once they define their service territory, they only need to go back and change that when their service territory changes. So in 2008, the FCC made a decision, a tentative decision, to collect such data, but that was never acted upon, and it sat on the table for the past 2 years, and I think it was rather unfortunate, because had they acted then, we might not have had to run the BTOP and BIP program in the dark the way we did.
And so what immediate steps would you recommend?
I believe the record is quite complete on this issue of availability data, and I think the Commission should immediately move to an order on the issue and reform Form 77 to require service providers to detail their availability and service quality areas.
Does anyone else have comment on that? Ms. Gillette, would you like to comment, or would other witnesses care to comment on what kinds of approaches we might take in order to obtain better data on the extent of real availability? Mr. Garcia.
Mr. Chairman, I think it's important to know when we speak percentages, we got to have a baseline number to get that percentage from. And so when we say 95%, 90%, there's the 3 A's that we ought to keep in mind is accessibility, affordability, and availability. They're all they could really muddy up the statistics that we provide. But I think if we don't know how many families, for instance, in our rural area, if we don't know how many families could have that service, and we only take data on the ones that have service, there's no way to gain a percentage, and so the percentage number of serviced areas would be fictitious. So I think it's important to realize that the data gathering concept ought to be kind of reevaluated and look at how can we best get the data.
All right, thank you. Mr. Dankberg.
Yes, the other thing I would add is that one of the points in the FCC National Broadband Plan was that the actual speeds that were delivered are in many cases much lower than the advertised speeds. And in order to collect this data and make it useful, it seems like besides just the availability of broadband, there ought to be some definition of what that service actually is besides just the advertised speed.
All right, thank you very much. My time has expired. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dankberg, I just appreciate your Will Rogers quote. I'm reminded of another quote that Will Rogers said is that be thankful that we are not getting all the government we are paying for, which I think
I'm glad you said that one.
Goes to my question to you. You're saying today that you don't need a subsidy. You don't think we need a subsidy to go ahead and push broadband.
Yes, I think that there's been a point made when we talk about unserved and underserved, and there's a lack of definition. And the thing that we would really strongly advocate is that if there were a definition of what broadband is, that I believe that satellite would qualify, and that we have made a business of providing that level of service, whatever it is to be defined, without government subsidies. Yes.
Ms. Gillette, you seem to hedge a little bit on the figures here. The chairman mentioned that he thought the figures were too optimistic, and I think in your opening statement you talked about that, in fact, the figures could be wrong. And I think you went ahead and talked about new figures which would indicate that it went from 7 million households being unserved to 12 million households. Is that correct?
No, almost. I wouldn't say the figures are wrong. I would say that the figures are all of necessity estimates because we don't have perfect data about any of this, and that's one of our goals is to improve the data about it.
In your opening statement, though, I think you actually used some figures here that we wrote down.
Yes, the figures are that we approached sizing the gap from two directions. We tried two different methods to reach for both imperfect types of data. One of them is a model, and that tells us 7 million households.
I'm not interested in so much the process. I'm just saying, quoting your data, I still get
14 to 24.
Yeah, I still get about 92% of Americans.
That's right. That was what I said in my testimony. Exactly.
So that's the bottom line is that's a pretty good figure still.
It still means 24 million households 24 million people without any broadband service.
But I think Mr. Dankberg is saying that maybe some of these people are not in the rural areas, that they're in areas that are in urban areas, which is going to what his original statement was from Will Rogers. Another question for you is that...
I don't disagree with him on that.
Okay. In my opening statement, I talked about in the year 2000, there were 8 million people that had broadband, and 10 years later, there's 200 million. Isn't it possible that, and this is a question, I'm just going to go down all, isn't it possible, based upon those figures, that we went from 8 to 200 million, that without any government doing anything in the next 10 years, by the year 2020, that we'll have complete, universal, ubiquitous broadband? Do you think that's true without any government? Just yes or no?
No, I don't.
You, Mr. Villano?
No, I don't.
And Mr. Garcia? No?
No.
No?
I think it's possible. Yes, I do think it's possible.
You do, yes, yeah. Mr. Carroll? No? Mr. Eisenach?
I think we're very close to being there today, so the answer is yes.
Yeah. So, okay, so you're folks saying that the private market cannot go and cover this ubiquitously without the government stepping in and doing something, except for Mr. Eisenach and Dankberg. Now, I say to the rest of you, Mr. Dankberg needs a payroll, started out in his garage and built a business to $1 billion. So I would say, if I put you guys all on a scale, I would say he would certainly have much as credibility as all of you on the other side of the scale, just because he's done it. And I admire him for starting this company and getting to $1 billion. And he showed us graphs that obviously there's some urban areas that don't have it, and he's saying through his video that by and large we can do it. So I think we all have to be careful to be that perhaps the market can do it on itself. Mr. Dankberg, the 5% of homes that have no broadband access are likely in parts of the country that are high cost and low population density. So sometimes there's little incentive for private companies to deploy there. So I'm just being the devil's advocate with you here. Does this mean that you could still get into those through satellite broadband in these areas, notwithstanding that most companies, telephone companies and most cable companies won't go in because it's so rural?
Yes, all the terrestrial technologies depend on the distance between homes and some central anchor point. Satellite, the good thing about satellite communications is that it's distance insensitive. So the real issue is just, can you economically deliver enough bits, enough bandwidth to those people, and that's really a technology and economics problem.
Okay, Ms. Gillette, just if it could just answer yes or no. Does Section 230 make it the policy of the United States to preserve the vibrant and competitive free market that it presently exists for the Internet and other interactive computer services unfettered by federal and state regulation? Isn't that true? That's the Section 230?
I believe that's what the statute says, yes.
In striking the FCC attempt to regulate network management, didn't the D.C. court just explain that the congressional policy statements of congressional policy can help delineate the contours of statutory authority. I think the answer is yes to that. And so I just caution the FCC, and my point is to go ahead and get involved with either net neutrality or ancillary authority to augment it through regulation, and that's my only point. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stearns. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, let me just restate that I do believe that the FCC has the authority to be able to act, notwithstanding the court decision. Obviously, from 1996, after the Telecommunications Act passed, all the way up until Chairman Powell, they implemented all of the provisions that created this broadband revolution. Remember, not one home in America had broadband in February of 1996 when the Telecommunications Act was signed. Not one home had it. So those changes in policy obviously had to be implemented by the FCC in order to create this new environment that makes all of this conversation even possible. So I do believe that the FCC has this authority, and I ask them to explore the various means by which they can reach the point where they can implement the recommendations of the broadband plan that has been put together. What I would like to do is to focus on the Broadband Data Improvement Act, that we passed out of this committee about 3 years ago. We based it upon Connect Kentucky. How is that plan going? How is the data collection going under that law, Ms. Gillette, and is it helpful to the FCC?
Extremely. That program is administered by the NTIA, and they have given grants to all of the states at this point who are all collecting data according to a protocol that the FCC consulted. We provided technical consultation with the NTIA on that, and the data is coming in, and the maps will start being assembled next fall.
Now, the information as you can see it at this particular stage, does it indicate that there are gaps across the country? And do you think that this mapping is going to help us to move beyond kind of anecdotal to actual factual basis for making new policies here in the country?
I'm totally certain the maps will be helpful and the data will be helpful. It's just beginning to come in, so it's too early to say much about it, but I'm sure it will be very helpful.
So we will wind up with much more specificity than we've had in the past.
Yes.
And we'll be able to deal with what the chairman is talking about in terms of finding out what actually is going on in Virginia and not have it be based upon a company just sending in information without it being corroborated.
Well, there's an elaborate protocol for collecting the information, some of it from industry, but also one of the nice things about having states administer these grants is often there's a lot of local knowledge of people of what's actually going on in their territory, and we're hopeful that that will help improve the quality of these maps.
Okay, great. Now, let me ask you about the E-rate. Let me move over to that for a second. The FCC, has been looking at expanding E-rate, looking at after-school hours as well, dealing with the reality of how children actually live their lives. Could you talk a little bit about that and the funding streams necessary to make sure that we actually deal with the real-world 2010 life of a child in school in America?
Absolutely. One of the recommendations of the plan was to look at learning as a continuous process and not just confined to the school walls. In February, the Commission passed a waiver order and a proposed permanent rule change to allow community use of school E-rate funded facilities after hours. That's one example. Another is that the plan discusses the use of wireless connectivity. Kindles and other kinds of electronic books require wireless connectivity. Students can take them home, and that brings them broadband to the home where they may not otherwise have it. The many innovative uses we could make of the E-rate program, and we're starting to implement on exactly those proposals at this point.
Yeah, within a very small number of years, half of the children in our country are going to be minorities. And we just have to deal with the fact that we need a broadband plan for those children to give them the portable skill set that they're going to need in order to compete for jobs in our economy as it unfolds. And unless we think of the E-rate as a flexible tool to deal with this ever-expanding need for kids to have the skill set, then I think, ultimately it will come back to really haunt our economy. So I thank you for that testimony. And again, I just want to come back to this point. We just can't have a national plan put together alone by a small handful of communications colossi. We need to ensure that we have a wide-ranging entrepreneurial, Darwinian, paranoia-inducing internet world out there, broadband world, where everyone is given a shot here at providing the leadership for our country. And if we step aside and just allow a couple of companies to decide the pace at which new gadgets, new applications, who's going to have access to it, then we're going to be the losers because China and India and other countries will just blow right past us with their plans to capture these sectors. And we just should not be looking at the outsourcing of jobs as each year goes by because the skill sets aren't here, because the technologies haven't been developed here. That's our real opportunity here. That's what the National Broadband Plan gives us as a national challenge. When America has a plan, America wins. When we don't, we lose. We have not had a plan. We've dropped from 2nd to 15th in the world. We just have to implement something, and we cannot delay that implementation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Markey. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shemkus, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really do love this committee. We are behind Liechtenstein. I just want to remind people, keep using that, or Moldova, or the Netherlands. You can, so I'll be patient. But come on, can we get off this comparing us to Liechtenstein just for a minute? What the FCC did, if you really want paranoid people competing to fill the broadband space, you need to deregulate. What the FCC did, based upon the telecom bill, was deregulate. They didn't re-regulate. That's what the FCC is trying to do now. What they want to do, since they failed in the courts, now they want to re-regulate. They want to go back to the dial-up phone. So we have no, we don't. So anyway, you can see there's a divergent opinions here in the committee, and I love Mr. Markey. And I've learned all my interactions from him. I keep reminding him of that. So when he disapproves of my line of questioning, I just learned it from the best. So it's a tribute to him. Mr. Turner, do you believe the analysis in the broadband plan that 95% of the country has access to have access to broadband is flawed?
If you define broadband as on or off, meaning something or nothing, I think it's close to being correct. 92 to 95% have something. If you were talking about broadband at a level that they define it at 4 megabits per second, I think it's overstating the level of availability.
So you would say it's flawed in your second definition?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Do you believe the FCC currently lacks adequate information on the actual state of broadband availability?
Yes, I do.
Do you think the FCC should collect better data on broadband deployment?
Yes, sir.
Then shouldn't we refrain from taking action on the broadband plan until the FCC has that data?
Well, sir, I think if you've looked at the calendar of items that will be proceeding, the agency is certainly one that's thorough, but it doesn't move very quickly. So I think we should, yes, immediately move to start collecting that data as the proceedings and debate over the policy.
But the rollout of the money. I mean, this has been a constant debate that we've had since the stimulus money, saying don't roll out until you know the need.
Well, I agree, and I think if you look at the calendar, they probably won't be spending a single dollar of new USF money on the new Broadband Connect America Fund at least until 2012.
But that's USF money. I mean, there's millions of dollars going out the door right now.
Yes,
billions.
It is rather unfortunate that, as you said earlier, the cart was put before the horse in that case.
Thank you. Mr. Villano, you do permit grant money to be used even if the majority of households covered by a project are in non-rural areas and even if they already are served by one or more providers. Is that correct?
In our Community Connect program, right. The area has to be totally rural and no one in that community.
Yeah, no, in the RUS program.
We have several programs.
In the stimulus.
In the stimulus?
I'm talking about ERA, and that's kind of the connection.
Right, we require that the community be unserved or underserved, and we send our field staff out there before any.
Well, let's talk about Hays, Kansas for a second. You understand that the Kansas broadband map shows that all but 200 of the over 11,000 households in Hays already have broadband from one or more providers, including a small employee-owned business. Is that really a good use of government funds?
In Hays, Kansas,
that's right.
We did provide a BIP award to a Kansas-based company.
All right, let me just stop there. Mr. Garcia, is that a good use of government funds if we're providing money to providers in an area that there's already competing broadband deployment when, I like the way it was put, 10% of the Indian tribal areas have access, which means 90% do not. Don't you think it would be a better use of money to send that to areas where there's no coverage?
I believe it would, but the complexities of how these proposals are applied for is what drives the funding and where the funding.
I disagree that they're very complex at all. I would say either a person has service or they don't. Mr. Turner, you used the example of the grocery store. Either they have a defined broadband speed and they can get access to it, or they don't. And shouldn't we then, going back to the first question, know who has service before we send money to people who may have competing broadband applicants?
I think it's absolutely, for the benefits of efficiency and the benefits of maximizing the money, it's important to have the right data. However, I understand what this body was trying to do in the context of stimulus, and I defer to the collaborative judgment of this body in making that decision.
Well, and that's my time's expired, and that's where we disagree. I think we spent money and we put people who are already providing broadband. We empower competitors to compete against with government subsidized dollars in the broadband field, and that's a failure of what we've done. And I'll end on Mr. Dankberg. I do support technologically neutral in competition for services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shimkus. The gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask Ms. Gillette, having followed the Comcast case, do you anticipate that the Comcast decision of April 6th would affect your analysis of these universal service issues or the recommendations in the National Broadband Plan in any way? And if so, why and how?
Our general counsel is assessing the impact of the Comcast decision on our authority to support broadband via USF.
Thank you. And Mr. Villano, as you may have gleaned from my opening statement, the U.S. Virgin Islands has not received grants under ARRA funds for broadband infrastructure. One of the things that I'm concerned about is that the existing landline telephone service provider, Vitelco, is considered the incumbent borrower and is a troubled entity. To what extent, if any, do you think this would affect other entities in the Virgin Islands from receiving ARRA funding, the fact that the incumbent is in problem?
Well, we just closed the second NOFA, and there weren't any applications from the Virgin Islands for a second round of funding. I don't know the reasons why, but there weren't any applications for our second round of funding.
Wow. That surprises me because I thought we had applied. Okay. Well, also...
They could have applied under the NTA BTOP program for a middle mile project, but there were no last mile projects under the BIP program at RUS.
Okay. Okay. Well, just to continue on the concern that Mr. Shimkus was raising, so is it true that RUS does allow grant money to be used in non-rural areas regardless of whether that area includes a majority of households covered by a project and is already served by one of the major providers? And if so, is there an appeals process in place that one of the companies that are already there?
But the award in question was made under our first NOFA, and we have a definition of unserved and underserved areas. In that particular case, 95% of the service territory had no broadband service. It was just 5% of the geographic area that was covered by the loan grant combination that the applicant was awarded did have some terrestrial-based service.
Okay. So is there a process for appealing?
No, there is no process for appeal.
Okay. I guess, well, I guess I'll ask you also again, Mr. Villano, will NTIA and RUS collaborate on broadband infrastructure awards, and what effect will that have on applicants who have submitted multiple applications?
Definitely, we will continue our collaboration. Even though we have separate NOFAs this time, I can tell you we're in constant communication and coordinating our efforts. Under the second NOFAs, RUS is focusing on last mile and NTIA is focusing on middle mile. But we are working very closely together to make sure that we get the best bang for our buck.
Okay, so you're saying then that it won't have any effect on applicants who've submitted multiple applications, or it'll be coordinated in some way?
Under our first NOFA, we allowed for joint applications, and that did complicate the process for some applicants. That's why we went with separate NOFAs and separate application process this go around. So, we will look to make sure that there aren't any overlaps if they're proposing to fund a project and we are in a particular area. We want to make sure that we get the money to the most areas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Christensen. The gentleman, Mr. Boyer, is not here. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Griffith, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Gillette. Thank you. The FCC, as it rolls out the National Broadband Plan in an attempt to deploy to the remaining 5%, are we concerned about adoption or how we're going to measure adoption rates? Is that a problem, or is that a concern that we have?
Adoption is very important. It's a very central part of the plan is to take steps that increase the adoption of broadband. I would say that our data on adoption is actually better than our data on availability because that's what we collect as subscribership data, and we are now publishing ranges of adoption data in our semi-annual reports.
Thank you. One other question: as we look at the FCC's recommendation for deployment for national broadband, has the exemption for the electric cooperatives from FCC pole attachment regulations been considered?
I'm sorry, was it in the National Broadband Plan? Was that issue
Right.
raised? Yes, it was raised in the National Broadband Plan that poles are an essential, access to poles is essential for deploying broadband, and there isn't a uniform national framework, and that's a congressional a question for Congress to consider.
Is that are we suggesting that we'll continue with that exemption for the?
It's currently part of the statute. So in Section 224, that's how it's set up. That there's separate frameworks for how those are regulated, and that would be up to Congress to decide if that's the right framework to continue or not.
So that's really a question for me. Thank you very much. Okay, Mr. Villano. The second round of the Broadband Initiative program allocates $100 million to satellite projects to provide broadband services to unserved areas. Most U.S. satellites have a national footprint. How is the RUS determining what is an unserved satellite area?
We'll be posting maps of the service areas that we fund and NTIA funds under the Broadband Initiatives and the BTOP program. And the satellite component, we have an RFP that will be published later this month that will make that money available. We're dividing the country into 8 regions, and we'll let competition dictate how we award those funds. But those would be areas that have no broadband service and would not be able to receive service under the Recovery Act.
In light of some of the data or some of the comments that we've heard today about what we believe is true and what is actually true in unserved areas, are we reviewing what we think is true and what is actually true in the?
Well, I can tell you for every award that we've made under our Broadband Initiative program, we send actual RUS staff out to the field to verify the information that was provided by the applicant, and we also post all the maps of the proposed service territory, so incumbent service providers can comment on that, whether they do provide service. We look at the comments, we look at the application, we send feet on the ground to ensure that those areas meet the definitions of the NOFA.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Dankberg, I understand that satellite broadband services offer an opportunity to reach U.S. consumers in otherwise unserved areas.
when the FCC imposes conditions on license transfer applications that limit the business models of satellite operators, does that make it more difficult or less difficult to raise money to continue satellite services?
The only thing I can talk about is our experience, and we've had fantastic support from the FCC in approving our licenses and being innovative in spectrum and in approving the transfer of licenses when we acquired Wild Blue.
So it really has not been a concern.
The FCC, from our perspective, has been very supportive, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Griffith. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, is recognized for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The residents of and small businesses in my district in Pittsburgh have contributed to the tens of billions of dollars worth of subsidies to support telephone service in rural areas and for low-income people. In 2010, these dollars are still being used for telephones, not broadband. Now, the FCC has outlined a universal service fund reform in the National Broadband Plan, and I'd like to just start with Mr. Garcia and work down through the end of the panel. Number one, do you support that plan, what you like about it, and how you would improve it? And if each could just do that briefly, I'd appreciate it. Mr. Garcia.
We support the fact that the universal service has to be reformed, but we also caution that the services that are part of that plan right now not be restricted or diminished, but there's got to be more accountability in terms of why that fund has been around for a long time. And so why do we still have a lot of areas that have not benefited from that very fact? And so we need to employ that a little bit harder and be more deliberate in how that service funds are used for that. So we don't want to diminish what's there, but in addition to what we just testified upon, we need to build on those opportunities. So we need to keep that, though.
Thank you, Mr. Turner.
We are generally supportive of the framework, certainly of a transition. We think it's time to modernize the fund. We do have some concerns about what's going to happen during the transition, particularly issues as Dr. Eisenach has raised, that we do have areas where there are unsubsidized providers, either cable or wireless companies, that are competing against a subsidized telephone provider, and that may not be the best use for our resources. Well, we're also concerned that even some subsidized providers themselves, where no other unsubsidized providers exist, have already deployed broadband and could be self-sustaining if all of their revenue streams are taken into account. But today, only the regulated streams are taken into account while they're recovering the cost of their full infrastructure. So we're concerned that the FCC should address some of those as we do the transition.
Thanks. Mr. Dankberg.
I think the major issues that we have is that the artifacts of where unserved people are in a broadband environment is much different than where unserved people are in a voice environment. We have networks that were built for voice. You can support long loop lines. That leaves, by definition, it's what you've seen on the map, people who are well served by voice but are not served by broadband. And so the notion that you can segregate areas of served and unserved people like you can with voice, I think is not a good starting point for building policy.
Mr. Carroll?
The American Public Power Association doesn't have a position on that, but from my position at Hopkinsville Electric System, I think broadband could be expanded by using those funds. I think there needs to be, we need to ensure that the different entities out there that provide services have access to those funds universally, not just the telephone company.
Dr. Eisenhower.
I would just say two things. I think the plan doesn't go far enough, fast enough, as described, talking about saving $15 billion out of 45 or so over the course of a decade. Implies that $30 billion during that period of time is still going to get spent on what we're spending money on now. My second point would be I think the Commission has known for a decade, and so has most people in Congress, that this is a failed program. This docket was initiated. The docket number under which all this is considered is 9645. It was opened in 1996 and has been going on since with 250,000 or so filed comments. The Commission has tried heroically half a dozen times at least to reform it, and it has failed. So my point to this committee would be if you want that money going to broadband, you ought to keep a very close eye on the Commission's success or failure in implementing these reforms it's proposed.
Thank you. Ms. Gillette, I've heard some concerns that the universal service fund reform would mean that some people's phones would be turned off. Is that the case? And if it's not the case, would you state why it is or why it isn't?
It's not the case, and it would not be the case because the plan's recommendation is that the funding should be targeted from, shifted from voice-only networks to networks that provide both broadband and high-quality voice.
Okay, I think that's important to get out. Mr. Dankberg, in light of what you said to Mr. Stearns, Mr. Villano from the Rural Utility Service has set aside $100 million for satellite broadband. I assume your company won't be taking a cent of that money? You're not interested in any of that money?
Oh, we'd be crazy. And if there's money to be made in subsidies, then we will use it. I think we'll use it far more efficiently.
Oh, okay. So you would take some government assistance if
actually, excuse me.
It sounded like you told Mr. Stearns that you weren't interested in that and you didn't need it.
So I'm just, from a free enterprise perspective, if I'm competing with other carriers who are subsidized, am I supposed to compete on an unsubsidized basis with companies that are given thousands of dollars per home served? I don't know how to respond to that.
Yeah, well, I'm not asking you to. I just thought that's what you told Mr. Stearns, and I just wanted to get clarification on it, that if there's money there, you'll take it. And maybe just finally, since I still have a minute and 30 seconds in the remaining time, you heard what Ms. Gillette said about whether or not this universal service fund reform would result in people losing their telephones or not. Does anybody have any further comments on that? And generally, I take it you all support reform. You just think it needs to go a little quicker and a little further than it's going right now. Is that accurate? Okay. All right. Well, I think I've asked everything I want to, Mr. Chairman. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Doyle. The gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yes, good question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of you for your patience with us today. Mr. Turner, I want to be sure that I understood you to say that you did think it was unfortunate that we had put the cart before the horse when it came to not doing the mapping and not doing our definitions. Did I understand that right? Yes or no is sufficient?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for that. And Mr. Garcia, I appreciate that you appreciate the fact that the fund has been around for a long time, but the money doesn't seem to get out very quickly. I think that's a frustration whenever you see government step in to what the private sector has done. And Mr. Chairman, I want to ask unanimous consent to enter for the record an editorial from the Washington Post that indicates that heavy regulation is unnecessary in light of the broadband plan's analysis that 95% of the country has access to broadband, and we've gone from 8 million broadband subscribers to 200 million in the last 10 years. And
without objection, that will be made
Thank
a part
you,
of the
Mr.
record.
Chairman. Dr. Eisenach, with my questions to you, doesn't this suggest that our deregulatory approach is working and that we should focus any government efforts just on the 5% or the 7 million homes that are in an area that does not receive the private sector access to the broadband services?
Absolutely.
And I appreciate your answer on that. I also had another question I wanted to ask you. When we look at the issues of network neutrality, unbundling, compelled wholesaling, rate regulation, is there any economic validity to the arguments that these issues, network neutrality, unbundling, compelled wholesaling, would encourage broadband deployment to the last mile, and wouldn't regulating broadband just chill the investment innovation that we have seen over the past 10 years that has led to 200 million homes being connected?
In two respects. In the first respect, as a matter of economics, these issues have been very fully studied. Last week, I was one of 21 economists, very broad-based group, former CAB Chairman Alfred Kahn among us, filing comments with the Federal Communications Commission, specifically on the point of the net neutrality NPRM. And our conclusion, simply put, is that the economic evidence simply does not support those proposed rules, and indeed that those proposed rules, if adopted, would reduce innovation, reduce investment, reduce deployment in the way that we're talking about here today. The same set of data, I think, or the same economic facts are there on the issue of unbundling. And indeed, there's a lot of evidence in the FCC's National Broadband Plan on that
If I can insert one
point.
additional question, I guess the same would apply to the reclassification broadband?
Well, absolutely, because the reclassification is simply a precursor and would be seen in the marketplace as a precursor to imposing this sort of heavy-handed regulation. The second issue is the Commission has laid out a very ambitious agenda. As I implied earlier, it will be interesting to see how well it does keeping to the schedule that it's laid out. If it were to embark on these major new rulemakings, already in the middle of one of them on net neutrality, on reclassification, on unbundling, and so forth, I simply questioned whether or not universal service won't once again, as it has for 15 years, fall to the back of the pack in terms of priority. And we'll end up sitting here a decade from now saying, why are we still spending now $8 billion on the high-cost fund subsidized telephone service?
Thank you. I appreciate that. Ms. Gillette, I've got just a few minutes left, but I want to go back to something. Mr. Markey said when we have a plan, we win. When we don't, we lose. And we all believe that, but we think we got the cart before the horse on this one. It looks like there are many on the panel that agree with that. And so we do have concerns about how you all will go about as you assess the data that you say is now beginning to come in, and you're saying you think you are going to have sufficient data to address what you term the broadband gap by early next year. So as you do this, how are you going to look at that and address this gap, but make certain that existing consumers are not going to see their rates go up, that they are not going to see additional taxes, additional fees, that they are not going to see their rates go up? Because one of the concerns we hear is that they're concerned that if you all get involved in this, then consumers who like the plan they've got right now, they're going to see their rates elevated. So what's your plan to address that?
A couple of things. First of all, the premises of the plan is that the universal service stays at the size it is, so the burden would not go up on consumers. And secondly, that about the data point, between the BDIA map and the better data that the FCC is proposing to collect, by the time, as Mr. Turner says, by the time we are able to implement these, I just received word that the first proceeding in the universal service reform was just adopted 5-0 by the Commission this morning. So we're on our way doing that, but by the time we get new rules in place and new money flowing, the new data will be in and available for use.
Okay. I'm out of time. Yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Blackburn. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for Mr. Villano. Mr. Villano, last year, Senator Menendez and I sent a letter to your agency and also to the NTIE expressing concerns about the number and the amount of broadband stimulus grants that had been awarded to small and minority applicants in your initial rounds of decisions. And I'd like to know what you have done to improve those numbers. What percentage of your total awards to date have been made to these types of applicants? And are there any additional improvements on the table in terms of increasing the number of approved applicants?
Well, thank you for the question. We did take those concerns very seriously when we developed our second NOFA. I think if you read the second NOFA, you'll see that we tripled the number of points that we afford to socially disadvantaged businesses in their applications. We also award non-socially disadvantaged businesses extra points if they provide lower cost service to socially disadvantaged businesses in the service areas. After we published the NOFAs, we did 10 workshops. Well, we had planned to do 10 workshops. One of them was shut down because of the snowstorms we had here in Washington. But we did 9 outreach and training sessions throughout the country. And at all those sessions, we had special outreach sessions for minority and Native applicants for the program. In NOFA 2, about 8% of the applications that we've received under the BIP program are from socially disadvantaged businesses.
Can you quantify the number of approved grants?
Under our second NOFA, which just closed on
The
March.
first one and the second one. We didn't get the one for the first one.
Okay. Under our first NOFA, we made 68 awards, and one of those awards was to a socially disadvantaged business. That was Rivada Sea Lion up in Alaska. Under NOFA 2, we have 61 applications from socially disadvantaged businesses.
Those have been approved. All right. And do you have any, are you satisfied with the level of applicants in the process and the level of outcomes in terms of your productivity?
We're pleased with the results under NOFA 2. We have a total of 776 applications for $11 billion in funding. We have a little over $2 billion available this round, and we're in the process of reviewing those applications and hope to have awards out this summer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rush. The gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Ms. Juck, could you respond to Mr. Garcia's suggestions about improving the relationship and the government-to-government relationship with the tribes in this context, on how that might work and how we can make it work?
Certainly, the plan, as you know, makes many recommendations, including a number that Mr. Garcia spoke about, including for example, the Office of Tribal Affairs at the FCC, seat on the USF Joint Board, and so forth. And we look forward to implementing those, and would be happy to. Our Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau will be implementing those recommendations, and I would be happy to have them get back to you with further information about how that's proceeding. And I would, we've also recently made public our implementation schedule, which has the dates and quarters of addressing a number of those recommendations on it.
Well, that's encouraging, and if we can help you at all, let us know. We appreciate
Thank you.
that. We think that's very important. Mr. Turner, I wanted to ask you about FCC authority in light of this case that came down. The FCC has identified several areas that could be impacted of this that people may not think of, including cybersecurity efforts, universal service reform, access for disabled Americans, and consumer privacy. There's a whole list of things that could be affected. If the FCC does nothing in response to this decision, what will happen to the FCC's ability to advance those policy goals?
It's cast into serious doubt. I think if you look at the statute and look at how the statute was developed, Congress at the time clearly treated and wanted to treat the wires that bring us these services differently from the services themselves, and this was the heart of 230B. Hands-off approach to the Internet services, but a light regulatory touch where needed on the wires. And I have a lot of trust in the deliberative wisdom of Congress and the shelf life of these laws, because they're based on principles like universal service, non-discrimination, interconnection, competition, and reasoned deregulation. The path Congress gave the FCC for deregulation was Section 10. Chairman Powell chose to do a different path through this redefinition process, and I think, you know, in the words of Justice Scalia, this was sort of a Mobius strip type of reasoning that ignored the statute. I think Chairman Powell thought he could stand up all the other principles of interconnection, universal service, non-discrimination, disability access, all of that on this ancillary authority theory, and the court case has shown that that is not going to be able to be the case. So the move towards reclassification doesn't have to be seen as a radical move. It simply will be a move that puts the FCC's regulatory framework back in harmony with the law, and I guarantee you it will come with some type of heavy forbearance on all the rules that are intended to apply to monopoly telephone networks. They certainly will not be applied to broadband networks, and we must remember that today the enterprise broadband market that serves the biggest businesses in the country is currently regulated under Title II, and that's one of the most competitive markets, and they're not screaming for deregulation, and there's heavy investment going on there.
Dr. Eisbeck?
If I could just jump in very quickly and say, at least with respect to the net neutrality regulations that are proposed, the non-discrimination provisions are not less restrictive on broadband than what was put in place on telephone networks in the past. They are more restrictive. The non-discrimination provisions that were in place on telephone networks in the past permitted just and reasonable discrimination. The proposed net neutrality regulations explicitly reject that approach and say there will be no discrimination of any kind. To suggest that the private sector could have any confidence that the regulations that will be imposed under a Title II classification are less restrictive than what have been imposed in the past is just violated by the proposed rules we have in front of us today.
Well, I would just point out that I think it's even a dicier gamble to have any confidence that if we don't do something about net neutrality, there won't be marketplace efforts to restrict access to content. And I think it is clear we need action on here, and I appreciate Mr. Turner's views in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Inslee. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Space, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This map is a map of the state of Ohio, and as you can see in the southwestern corner, there's a big green area, which would indicate the unserved area pursuant to the work done by Connect Ohio, which is modeled on Connect Kentucky, and I have a lot of faith in the work that they've done in trying to decide or determine just where access to broadband exists and where it doesn't exist. And the effect that that's having on the people of southeastern Ohio is significant. If you look at the unemployment rates in these counties, 5 of them are above 15%, 1 above 18% right now. That represents the unemployment rate, doesn't even factor in the tens of thousands of people that are fully employed but are working in poverty. This is a significant problem that hampers economic development. It limits our already limited access to health care and education. We see the role of broadband in its integration in the health care delivery and educational delivery systems as in its infancy right now, going nowhere but up. And the longer it takes for us to obtain this access, the farther behind we're going to fall. That also happens to correspond almost identically with my congressional district. And we're working hard to see what we can do to provide access to this very important technology. And one of the questions I have for the panel, I'm going to ask a number of you specifically to just give, if you can, because our time is limited, a 2 or 3 sentence response to this question. What, Ms. Gillette, I'm going to ask you first. What is it that we can do, Congress can do, to facilitate extension of that last mile to, although it's maybe 5% of the population, maybe 7%, I don't know, but I know that percentage is a lot bigger in areas like this. What can we do as a Congress to facilitate the extension of that last mile to those people that don't have any access right now?
I'd suggest 3 things. First would be to work with us on the universal service reform so that we can target the funds to the places that are unserved. It's a complicated system, as Mr. Eisenach mentioned. Reform has been tried many times. There's lots of people in the current system, so it's complicated, and we appreciate your support with that. Second is we propose to do it in the plan with no additional funds, but the plan does also propose an option for Congress to consider an appropriation which could help make it go faster. And the third thing is, I think your point about you've got the data, you know where these places are. That's great. The cooperation of industry and making sure we have accurate availability data is key.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Villano?
Certainly. I would suggest that anybody that you have that is looking for service in those areas would contact their Russ Field representative to determine if they could apply for one of our programs. Under the Broadband Initiative Program, we made 4 awards in the state of Ohio under NOFA 1. Under NOFA 2, we have 21 pending applications for $193 million. I hope that some of those are in your district.
They are.
And that they'll filter their way up to the top. But it would be most important for applicants to contact RUS and the Rural Development State Office to see which ways that, which programs that we have that may be of assistance to those communities.
Thank you. Mr. Eisenach, I want to ask you, because for maybe your perspective on how we bridge that last mile in places like this.
So first of all, I think doing something is important. Problem I don't think is going to entirely solve itself. I do think that satellite services, my earlier answer to the question, where will we be in 10 years, I do think that satellite, for a lot of purposes, is going to solve a lot of people's problems. I don't think it's going to solve the high capacity issue in terms of what you want in a hospital or what you want in a government office in areas like that. what works? What I've seen work is what is working in Virginia, a state where I've spent a lot of time looking closely, and I know is working in other places around the country, and that is looking at local solutions, right? So what we have in the state of Virginia is something called the Mid-Atlantic Broadband Council. I've been involved with that. The Southwestern Virginia Technology Council, the chairman's been intensely involved with that. And what those local groups are able to do is pull together businesses, governments, public, non-governmental organizations, and solve problems. These are problems of these are not problems of rocket science. These are problems of digging a ditch and putting some fiber in it,
right.
or putting up a tower. And often those problems just take the business community getting together with funding, but often it's a question of people getting together and saying, we need to put a tower up here, let's get it done.
Sure, and the problem, however, is in areas like this, those local community governments and many of the businesses are struggling to survive, and they don't have the means.
I'm for funding those efforts. I mean, just to be clear, those efforts in Virginia have been funded by a tobacco fund, and I think the RUS has been active in funding those efforts. Those are good efforts, and those efforts ought to be funded, in my view.
I know I'm over time, but the chairman's busy not paying attention to my time, so I'm going to go ask Mr. Dankberg. Mr. Chairman, may I have just one more minute?
Yes, sir. Go ahead,
Thank you,
Mr. Space.
Mr. Dankberg, the issue has to do with satellite availability in areas like this, and the problem is I see that is the capacity and the cost and the quality. I know you testify that you feel that they're comparable, but as we move forward, it's all about speed and it's all about quality and capacity, and I question whether or not the technology is there for satellite.
I understand that. I'm an engineer. We just designed a new satellite. It has 20 times the capacity, the best satellite ever. I think it's a question of economics, and what we would say is just set a target. If you set a target of 5 megabits, 10 megabits, we'll figure out what the economics are. We can deliver 5, 10, 15, 20. Set a number that you'd like, and then have a competition. And if we can't meet that number, we're happy to see it go somewhere else.
Right. Thank you. Mr. Dankberg,
Well,
my time has expired.
Mr. Space, if you'll yield to me just a second, the balance of your time, which will be extended as much as is necessary. I wonder, Mr. Dankberg, if you would make a projection of what the retail cost per customer is going to be for that new high-capacity satellite that you intend to launch.
So I think one of the main points that was made was the price of broadband coming down. Our new satellite, we're probably going to offer plans just like we do now, which are $50, $60, or $80, but we'll increase the speeds that we offer by a factor of 4, and the amount of congestion, which is really the reason that people perceive delay, will go down enormously.
So if you can afford $50, $60, or $80, that's fine. If you're among that category of individuals who can't, it becomes a problem.
So what we would say is we are completely fine with the idea of using subsidies to reduce prices for people who cannot afford it. We are absolutely okay with that. That can absolutely apply to satellite. And we propose to the RUS a satellite system that would make Lifeline broadband service available at $8 per month wholesale at 768 kilobits a second. All we want to do is have an opportunity to compete at whatever speed, and if subsidies are used, we just want to compete to provide service to all of Ohio for the same price that might serve one small village at whatever level of service is specified.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Dankberg. Mr. Stearns, I'll just recognize you. Mr. Space's time has expired.
I just want to ask, what speed would that be? You say 4 times. What would that speed be?
So the speeds for our new satellite, we expect to offer 2, 4, and 8 megabits per second as the speeds for our service at those retail prices. Our wholesale prices are about half of that. The retailers are the ones that mark it up by about a factor of 2.
All right, thank you, Mr. Dankberg. Let me say thank you to each of our witnesses today. We appreciate very much your taking this time and sharing your insights with us. I'm going to leave the record of this hearing open for approximately 3 weeks, during which period of time there probably will be some written questions propounded to you by members of the subcommittee. When you receive those questions, I hope you'll respond promptly, and we will make your responses part of the record of this hearing. And the gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Just ask unanimous consent for all member statements to be included in the record.
Without objection. With that, this hearing is adjourned with the thanks of the subcommittee.
Do you
It's good to meet you. Yeah, good to meet you.
Answer is very simple.
Thank you.
That sounds promising.
Do we know where the last mile is? If we don't know specifically where the last mile is, our data and the information that you all get and that everybody else gathers is lost in the aggregation of all the data across the country. And so you cannot go in there and pick out, and I believe that's what's happening. So, and I also contend that the last mile includes anything.
That's why we have to send people out to the field to actually verify it. But, you know, the one that they bring up in Hays, Kansas, 4,000 square mile service territory. 5% of it is Hays, Kansas, and